Open up your notes, your Bibles, your workbooks, whichever avenue you're using to follow along for these classes. Before we have our opening prayer, I want to specifically thank Rich for filling in last week. We gave him an extra large helping of responsibilities, and he, as always, rose to the task without complaint in my direction.
You made it easy. It was fine.
I try to make it easy for myself, and that's the preparation level I put in things, and so if it helps somebody else, that's great too. Right now, though, let's bow our heads together in prayer, and after that, we'll continue with our study. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the blessings we find in Jesus. Help us to then take those rescue moments as our own faith is growing and reach out to others who need the rescue of the cross and the strength that comes from brethren who are seeking to serve King Jesus and to serve God. And help us now as students to learn well, to be good listeners to your word, to ask the critical questions we need to mature our faith. This is the prayer we offer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so as noted, we are continuing our look into the history and geography of the Bible story. In your workbook, if you're following there, I think this is approximately lesson 27-ish in the way the workbook breaks things out. We're not precisely following that because we get to ask different questions, we have different needs. But in 27, 28, 29, the workbook, there are a series of extensive charts that is trying to accomplish a couple of things. In the email that was sent out for today's class, that was sent out yesterday, some of that information is replicated, speaking specifically, identifying the sequence of the kings. The email had both the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom, but also keying it into the primary biblical texts from the histories that address the lives of those kings. In so doing, you may begin to notice a few key details are identified. So let me ask a general question that kind of makes it easy when you think about it this way. How many of the kings, or which grouping of the kings, are from the lineage of David? You can answer those one of two ways. Either if you know the number, because they're listed out by number, or if you know how they're grouped together, because you think they're all Davidic line folks, because David was the king of physical Israel that went to Solomon and they divided, but there's something that happens in that kingly line. And so let's talk about Judah, or the southern kingdom. What would be your general answer to that question regarding the kings of Israel? How many ratio, number, specifics are part of David's family line? Southern kingdom?
Southern.
Say some, none, all?
Most.
Most is correct. There's actually only one that I'm aware of, I could be wrong, that isn't. And the one that isn't is also doubly uncommon. So which leader or ruler is in that space for a little while? She leads into the arrival, I see, gave you a name, into the arrival of a young king. Analiah or Athaliah is one of the 2 or 3 different names that you can use for her. And we'll see her again. She's uncommon in that she engages in extraordinary level of kingly behavior. Because how does she come to the throne? Is she appointed because everyone loves her? She absolutely appointed herself. She is either, and it's hard to kind of source this out because of the way in which genealogical structures are played in the Bible. We can't tell exactly if she's a direct descendant of Ahab or Omri, but both of them are excluded out of this family line in the way that her parentage is described. But what does she do to all the other potential heirs that she can find? Absolutely eliminates the risk, right? If there's no heirs. And she did that in part because what happened to her son who was on the throne? He died, he was killed on the throne, and in a series of complicated, kingly-like instances. And what happens to one of the kids? He was hidden. And think about the family structure that takes place. It's actually one of his aunts that hides him. And if you're thinking through the Bible and trying to latch things together to remember stuff, there's a lot of similarity in his survival to the survival going backwards of Moses and going forward to whom? Jesus. Jesus escapes a similar kind of genocide. The way we think about the Jesus slaughter that took place around the time of his birth is one of two ways. And there's some language things we have to figure out for that. These are important because they'll help us then when we think about this big picture of all these kings. In the case of Jesus, with the king of Era trying to silence the prophets that said a king has been born, it's either highly regionalized, just right around his area, or sometimes we think maybe the text is suggesting it was a bigger area. Most of the language seems to suggest it's pretty small, regionalized, because they kind of knew where it was. But you see the same kind of thing going on where somebody's threatened, all three stories. Their solution, rather than to acknowledge God, is to attempt to eliminate the threat. And in all three instances, because God had promised safety to this outcome, what we would consider extraordinary, implausible things take place. When things that are extraordinary or impossible or implausible take place, they start bordering into miracles. Miracles in the Bible are mostly thought in terms of here's a rule by which the world functions, and when a miracle occurs, it doesn't match the rule. It doesn't match the rule that you can come back to life. That's a miracle. It doesn't match the rule that with only this much oil your lamp can stay lit. It doesn't match the rule that X, Y, like the things will float that shouldn't float, etc. But keep in mind that that's not how the words are used. That's our emotional feeling about it. The words actually include when God exercises his capacity or power to supersede something else that's going on, even if it might normally occur according to the rule. Because the rule outside of God's hand in this is when someone goes to power and they're king, they have routinely killed everybody else without any kind of consequence because they are now the king. But God, in each of these instances, is subverting that to whatever is important or necessary for his plan and his purpose. So that tells us a lot about the southern kingdom, or Judah, listing of kings. We have a whole other batch of kings. How many of those kings are Davidic kings? They have the right to be on the throne because they are direct descendants of David's kingship. This is another easy one. If the southern ones are mostly David, the northern ones are not, right? And that's an important aspect to think about this because the reason we kind of think about it this way is in part this. The blessings that are promised to Israel are one batch of the covenant connection. And so roughly, I'm trying to take these off. I can see my writing, but I can't see you as much as I thought I would with these things on. The writings of the covenants, blessings for physical Israel, if you were to summarize them up, what would they be? Like what kind of things did God promise the people of Israel that they would receive through the land as recipients of the covenant? What was that? Their seed would be great. They'd be a big people. So that's part of those covenantal promises. Those go to the Abrahamic or the Genesis covenant, the Adamic covenant that comes from there. What else? Anything else comes in that says, because they're in Israel, they should be blessed by... How's the land going to take care of them? What's the land going to give them? Abundance, right? Big stuff. And what's the image, by the way, if you think back to the spies that go into the land, how does God show through their actions that the land is super abundant? calls it milk and honey, and they got these spies coming back. They got a pole between them. Imagine another spy behind me. What's hanging off of the pole? Grapes that are ridiculous, right? And we visualize those grapes in one of two ways. How do we visualize the grapes? If we're drawing by artists, we visualize the grapes are extraordinarily sized. The grapes become big. In the text, though, it's more like they're abundant. They're not like a little handful ball of grapes you can get at Aldi's or Kroger. They are dragging on the ground, big clumps of grape that exceed what we would normally expect. And so God says, if you keep the covenant, I will bless you like this. The land will produce. Contrast for that is they had left a land that was incredibly fertile, full of rich crop-growing soil that now, even to this day, is amazingly fertile. That land is half of the reason we have Egyptian cotton. The other half is we ship them cotton. And so those are the two reasons that have that connection there. But it's really good for growing stuff. Season's great, lots of water, great soil. Israel does not have that unless God is blessing it through the seasons and through his power. So abundance, people, protection. That then sets the foundation of what's supposed to be, but then the people asked for whom? They wanted a king. So there's this, I tend to think of it in a couple of different ways, but there's this wild hair that grows out of the covenant where they say we want a king, and a king is promised. And the hair grows and becomes actually part of the larger story, in that it becomes the story of our redemption, because redemption comes through that stream that grows out of that. And the covenant that's promised to David, that's promised to the kings, lives on the soil of the covenant that is for Israel. And so the reason we pay attention to this king context is because we're going to see that God is still keeping that covenant through times where Israel and the kings themselves are not themselves keeping the covenant. And so our first three kings we've already examined in more detail. Those are Saul, David, and I'm going to ruin Solomon for you all the time. So how many of you guys had time to read the email that was sent out and saw Solomon's Hebrew name? Solomon sounds pretty cool, right? The Hebrew for Solomon is roughly Shlomo. Shlomo. And is that, for those of a certain generation, Shlomo is part of a comedy context. You're like, King Shlomo? Who's King Shlomo? That's we've just brought it into English through steps to get to Solomon. Shlomo. And so that is our king who has all the potential. Now here's the reason why that might help you. Because King Solomon is a tragic comedy. I don't know if there's a smooshed together word for comedy and tragedy together yet. There probably is. I haven't heard it. But it is comedically sad of how his life plays out. Like, it's just so absurd. He's given everything possible to imagine, and it ends up an absolute mess. And that precipitates the largest span of the history of Israel, where it comes and becomes the, in essence, divided kingdom. The times where stuff begins to fragment. You'll notice as this breaks out, Israel's capacity, power, and strength gradually are eroded. So everything that had been achieved in the conquest in Saul, David, and Solomon is pulled away. It's pulled away to a certain degree at the very end in a series of three major conquests, where first the traitorous kings are eradicated and pulled off of their throne, and that whole section is pulled into captivity. And then you have the stepping down to where eventually even the holdouts of the southern kingdom or Judah or the descendants and kingdom of David is also now pulled off. And everyone is pulled into captivity before the return takes place. you were to summarize this, independent of northern kingdom or southern kingdom, and you can use a scale of most, some, or all. Those are our scale choices. How would you answer this question? How would you describe the kings of both kingdoms in regards to this status? Are they good or bad? So, how many of our kings are good?
Very few.
But my choice was some, so very few. There's some, because the reason I say some is that our subjective standard has to include the fact that they sometimes did the right thing. How many of them are bad? This should be the easy one. Most, right? Because in order to have a few good kings, we have to really work with their story and like skip some things in their life to get to a point where we're like, well, he's not entirely awful. Now that's something for me personally I think about when I consider historical kings throughout all humanity, even our current context. What is my expectation for an earthly king, given the evidence I have inside the biblical text? Should I expect them to be awesome? No. Even if I think I align directly with all of their published ideals, the odds seem to not be in my favor. All right? So that's like a learning point for this. And so when we go survey through this in a second, we're going to kind of see, and we've got them kind of broken out here in a summarization. These are not all of them. It's just an illustration of this. That you can kind of see subjective good king, and there are a few that might be amongst the really bad, some of the worst. And the terminology, you're just the worst. I just can't. You think about it in that usage sense. And even in that, when we're thinking about how this is playing out, how this works out, none of this ends up being great for the least of Israel. Even when the kings are good or whole, that is, they're like trying, the most oppressed and weak parts of Israel still suffer. Even in Solomon's reign, where you have a great wise king. You notice in Ecclesiastes, he recognizes what he is doing, and he is oppressing his servants. And the generation after increases the taxes even more, and puts more pressure on them. And so you see this downward perspective. So let's look through these. We're going to survey through them. We won't go into great detail, and think about what's going on and how all this happens, and the details surrounding it. So our first king is Rehoboam in Judah, serves for 17 years. And what are some of the things that you might recall about Rehoboam? Yeah, he refused to do so. Some argue, outside of whatever God's plan was biblically, that Rehoboam's leadership is what divided the kingdom. And the biblical text seems to match that pretty clearly too, that he's the one who made the problem. That's an interesting contrast, because he is coming from having all the answers. He grew up where all the answers were there for him. And the literature that is attributed to Solomon would have suggested he should have known better. He should have had insight. He should have had education, instruction to have made this better. Instead, he creates the context where 10 of the tribes rebel. That's an awful aspect of whatever is going to follow after this. Unity in God's kingdom is one of the things that's a constant spiritual objective. That if there is nothing that you can do, God understands that division is inevitable, but when you cause the problem, that's a high condemned behavior. You become equivalent in the prophets' writings to the troublers of Israel that came from the outside. In all of this context, though, he is also shown to a certain degree to have accomplished some good. And most of the kings do. It shows to us that he was faithful to God for a part of his time. The Levites and the other faithful to Jehovah choose to align with him. He has the legitimate claim to the kingdom in that regard. And he began the process of fortifying the border cities in Judah. So the smaller aspect of it. But in the end, however we want to think about it, whether he had a lot of his parentage in him or the world that was also around him besides the wisdom of his father, he left God. His outcome was, in the end, awful, and it is said regarding him, more evil was done by him than his predecessors. And that's another complicated thing because you think about the kings before him. On the one hand, we look at David and we say he's a man after God's own heart in the big picture, but what kinds of evil had he done? Adultery, murder, power-hungry, greed. His son, Solomon, who was then placed on the throne, had done great good, but then had gradually faded in his spiritual realm. And so in both of those cases, you see this play out slowly. Shishak of Egypt would attack both Israel and Judah. The records of Shishak found listing the 150 cities he attacked. And Rehoboam's solution to the problem was to buy himself out of it, right? He's like, I'll hear. Just take all this, take the temple, take the gold. Just don't hurt us. That's where faith, as I think about it, was evaporated. He had more faith in his stuff that his father had given him than what God had promised him. Remember, he had grown up in a world where his father's temple, his palace, overshadowed the temple of God because of all the factors around it. It was bigger, it was grander, included a massive garden. And this was in the time frame, just for our references. This is also in the paper charts and will show up in next week's message that I send out. Prophets around that time is a Shemaiah and then an unidentified man of God. If you're writing notes, I want to add a little tidbit for you that you may not have seen or we haven't talked about in detail. There are two generic phrases that occur inside your Bible's, Hebrew Bible in particular, for prophets. These are like titles versus names. Man of God is one of them. So very often someone who is not going to be named is simply broadly referred to as a man of God, without any kind of criteria. The other one of them is translated mostly into English as either son of the prophet, sons of the prophet, and in some of your translations it tries to go for the meaning. And that meaning for sons of the prophet in that usage is school of the prophets. But I want you to think of school, because this is how this word is being used, less like your standardized educational system and more like a school of fish. That is, they're part of the crowd of people that would surround a named prophet, but are also doing the same thing. And if you want a colloquial phrase, what does that mean in modern English? We might use, depending on context, entourage, the prophet's entourage. We might also use, especially when they're prosecuting, we would use the posse, the prophet's posse. That'd be a modern translation of the school of the prophets. But if it's someone who is in opposition to God, the same words are used to describe these things. So let's say it's a prophet of Baal, and their grouping of prophets, we would say the gang. It's a prophet's gang. All those words have similar meaning, right? Entourage, posse, and gang. We might even use those accommodatively in English. Well, that's why you could equally use to describe and understand when sons of the prophet or a son of the prophet is used, that it's the prophet's entourage. That's formal informal space, or it is his posse. And so that means often when they are going into conflict or to enforce rule or law, posse might come into place, or a gang if they are on the other side of the acrimonious table. And so all of those are describing what's going on. So it's a title in that sense more than anything else. They're associated. They're part of the group or the crew in that regard. So now whenever you see that in the Old Testament, just realize it's not really so much specifically a training place. They're like a trainee. They're part of the grouping of them. And they do many of the same things. They speak God's oracles. Sometimes they engage pre-law in worship. Even after the law, they serve in an intermediary place between Levite, which handles sacrifices, and God forthtelling and instruction. Our next king in the sequence of the timeline has us looking at the contemporary other side of the coin, which is Jeroboam. He takes over the other 10 tribes that will slowly be eroded. And it's interesting. I don't know if you guys have paused to kind of reread through these things when we think about Jeroboam. There is a hint of possible good that could come. Because at this point, when he's stepping into the role, everything isn't awful yet. Hasn't gone super downhill. And Judah, with its 2 tribes, isn't going great either. You've got, I don't trust God, I'm going to use our wealth to buy off Egypt, I'm going to find my safety in physical things. And there is a promise made to Jeroboam that he could be established if he's faithful. Matches precedent, right? Because that's how we get to David. We go from Saul to David, so it's not like a surprise twist ending. But he does something really awful. He sets up golden calves at Dan and Bethel. Establishes a new priesthood. And immediately the temple at Bethel is predicted to be destroyed. In the archaeological park at Dan, and we'll look at this later when we start paying a little more close attention to the details, they have excavated and reconstructed the spot where the shrine was positioned. So they know within a relatively good degree of certainty where the Dan temple was located. If you're remembering from some of the visuals I've shown over the last couple of years, that's where all the water is. That's where all the rivers are. That's where it's all super pretty. And it's a lot easier to provide water and food for your populace because it's up there. It's also near the space where Peter's confession takes place. And it's possibly near the place where the transfiguration occurs. It's all up there in the northern part. If you're thinking in terms of trying to understand space and distance, Athens, Georgia, is about as far from us, right where we're at, as Dan is from Beersheba, which is the bottom part of Israel. So that means that if you were going to try to drive all the way up to UGA, you'd be going up to the false idol to bow down where the golden calves are at. And so you can kind of put that in your brain. Doesn't mean you're actually doing that. I don't have any acrimony towards UGA, but you can kind of figure that out in your brain. And that means if you're going to try to go all the way out to the University of Oregon, you're going to have to go all the way around the globe to do that in comparative terms for those who are Oregon Duck fans. And so you'd be safe, I guess. There's no false idols there. But that's the picture you have. You have this potential of things going well, but the outcome is the exact opposite. This is also the beginning of a new leadership line in this segment. For this part, where you had one prophet seemingly focusing in on the southern kingdom, you have another prophet who seemingly focuses in on this part of God's people. This is why, when we began to talk this morning, I talked how the covenant covers the land and all the people. So God's grand covenant is over here. And then you have leadership agreements of you're going to be my king, or you're going to serve as the vessel for this other aspect, that grows out of that soil. And the Davidic line had its promise, and there could have been a different route had they chosen to follow after God. We don't know what the outcome of that line would have been, whether they would have had other responsibility. It doesn't go into great detail, just that you would have been established. God would have been in favor of you had you chosen to be in favor of God. Our next king, this bounces us back, so we're trying to follow the timeline here with this. Brings us to Ibazan. Let me add this. As it is with most Hebrew names, because your translation is locked into when it was translated, some of the words, as they're translated into English, are going to have different spellings and slightly different phonetic combinations. That's because English isn't a fixed language. We change the way we say things generationally. And we also learn a little bit more about Hebrew as we get closer and closer to the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is really a big shift in our understanding of ancient Hebrew. Is around 70 years ago or so we found those scrolls. So when we think about it, you might have in your list Abijah or Abijam. That's really having to do with what translation you're angling into. This is New King James American Standard, where I tend to use the ESV. Just a little bit more recent translation. And it also means that as long as you're close to pronouncing it, like you get like a couple of the consonants and a vowel or two right, you're fine. Don't fret too much, especially when we're reading those long lists. It's okay. Just read it with confidence and go on, and everything's fine. And so as long as you're in that space. So what would be notable about our second king of the southern kingdom? Should we be excited because they are a descendant of David and we think everything's going to go well? This is going to be a good king? Listen, if you were doing a standardized test and you didn't know the answer to the question and someone asked you, hey, is this going to be a good king of Israel, a good king of Judah? Odds are you could put no and be right most of the time. And so even if you didn't know, because you'll know when they're good kings. Like you're like, oh yeah, okay. That one shows up. They did a few good things. Almost always. Not so great. In specific, it's identified that he walked in the ways of Rehoboam. So now, put this in your head. Rehoboam exceeded the unrighteousness of his fathers. Worse than what was before. And then we have our next king. Potential for good, always there. Equal. Walked in the ways of Rehoboam. This is a point where I can identify a word play that's taking place in the Kings. From Genesis to the prophets, that's what I'm talking, all the major prophets, the concept of the afterlife is discussed, right? And there's some phrasing and terms. For the most part, those early descriptors of it are, go be with our fathers. That even goes into the early monarchy, where the tombs are established for the kings, and when they die, they are said both practically and then accommodatively to have gone to be with their fathers. So that's helping us kind of capture a detail that righteous, faithful living under the Israelite law would give you the opportunity to be found faithful and go to your fathers. That means that when it is used in a negative sense, like this, walked in the ways of his fathers, as opposed to the fathers generally, and all fathers that they're supposed to be angling towards, this is not only a sense of categorizing behavior, it's also saying faithfulness. In this case, lack thereof. Instead of being with the fathers who were true to Israel and true to God and true to Yahweh, this is one who is true to other things. It is over time, even in the latter prophets, where this will open up and help us see heaven more clearly, and it's fully revealed in the writings of Paul and the preaching of Jesus, where heaven becomes something with more detail and more fine data. Even in the Psalms, it's not given great weight of time to description. But he still worshiped in the temple. And so we have the scrappy version of temple number 1 going on here. We're not exactly quite sure of all the details because the wealth of this temple gradually gets pulled off, right? There's a series of events that has this place gets stripped of its wealth internally and then eventually stripped of its actual gilding that was going on. Most every American population center, for one reason or another, it seems like big ones, has a central dome building downtown that is often, but not exclusively, like the area of legislative space. And a lot of them are gilded, right? Where they've got that gold or fake gold roof. And when you drive it in there, it's like, oh, big thing, a bright light to you. Then it gets obscured by big buildings as the places grow up. Here's a parallel for you from antiquity. So when the Israelites are in Egypt, and it's around this time that pyramids start becoming a big thing, of the biggest ones, perhaps even some of the major pyramids built in Giza could have been built in the time frame that the Israelites were slaves. Those were also in very similar mechanics. All of our pictures of the pyramids are modern photos, right? Because cameras weren't around, we know that, right? So describe the pyramids to me as you see them now. What color are they? Brown, like everything else in Egypt. If there's nothing going on, because it's a constant state of being sandblasted. So that's there's a perpetual bead blasting business going on there, and every building is also often painted brown just to skip the process. A lot of sand colors. So what we see now is the unearthed pyramids that have actually at one point were completely covered in sand, and they've excavated the sand down. And when they initially did that, the next thing they did was start stripping all the rock off of it and all the fine marble that was still there. Some of it had already been stripped off in an earlier era, and they built churches out of it. And so in Cairo, the hanging church, because it hangs over the, not because of someone hanging, but it hangs over the roadway, was built of the stones of this. Now here's the thing. In its original form, when the Israelites would have likely been there, they would have been marble and then gold on top to reflect the sun. And so the Israelite temple that is built on top of the mount, after the Israelites had entered in, after they had used the tabernacle for an excessively large amount of time, was a high mountain that had a lot of marble as its base, and then the temple, the entire temple itself, was gold and multicolored, until they rebelled and it was slowly eroded away, being covered up in time and eventually destroyed more than once. Destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed, rebuilt. In this time frame, you find that Abijah and Jeroboam are fighting over the hill country of Ephraim because of its resources and its people. Jeroboam is then defeated. So we've now just moved about 20 years in total from the death of Solomon, and now we have constant conflict between the two nations. We're only incrementally away from the middle spot of Judges in the way we think about this. Judges began where Israel was fighting the pagan infighting inside of it, and Judges ended when Israelite was fighting Israelite. And you see some of that here. So we'll pause here before we get to Asa, which is a long-lasting king of Judah. That will be our next kind of thread line that starts around approximately 911 BC or BCE, if you're going to use that marking. But I got some questions for you. We are about near the halfway point in this study, roughly, as my plan has us going. We've got a couple events that will kind of put us close to about halfway right now. And so we've surveyed about half of our material and maybe half of the chronological record in front of us, because we'll cover another 1,000-ish years of human history from here getting through the resurrection. And when you think back on that, that allows us to think about some questions, our standard questions we haven't asked in a while. So in the first 1,000, actually probably about 2,000-ish years of recorded history that was surveyed, because it's not all in detail, was there anything in there that served as really bright spots, in the caveat, after the garden? So you can't talk about before Adam and Eve sinned in this equation. So what did you like from garden to divided kingdom? You're like, I really like that, and it was a good part of the story for me. I got my answer to the question, but I'm curious to what yours would be.
I like the way it started out with Solomon.
Yeah, everything started good there. As we're getting kind of the end of that time frame, there's a lot of potential. Rich, what do you got? You want to come back to you? You got a smile.
Well, I guess I like the part where we still see God's hand in all of the actions that are happening.
Right, and we'll see it again, even with Esther, where God is never mentioned, but he is assumed to have been active in the way we think about it. Anyone else have a like? Because you have a dislike option too. That's always part of our equation. I'll give you mine. The only thing I could think about that I'm like, I really like this, is the entire story of Ruth and Boaz, only if I get the whole story. Because it doesn't begin great, but it ends pretty good, right? And this is an exceptional story because God is folding in an other, an outsider, an unwelcome part, someone who is against Israel, and folds her in, not only into Israel, but into a line that already includes an outsider that very shortly will become the family of David. And when Ruth and Boaz are presented to us, they might be the power couple of the Old Testament. You find yourself a better couple than those two in the Old Testament text. Like they probably absolutely had a good chance of existing. You might include the parents of John the Baptist. They're listed there. We don't know enough about them. We also don't know anything bad about them, really. Where Ruth and Boaz, we get a good full narrative arc. That's everything a Hallmark movie should be. Like if you're looking like what a Hallmark movie is, that's that one. So you have that there, and I really like that. Anything you don't like, exceptionally don't like in that whole story? My whole thing is Judges. Like I don't like any of that. Like it's interesting. Even when you get Phineas or Ehud, it's still awful. I'm like, oh, that's less awful, but it's still awful. Yeah, Job is a mystery in all of that. Job occurs somewhere in this time frame. I tend to think Job is somewhere in that patriarchal leading into somewhere at the edges of captivity, perhaps. They could have been contemporary to Abraham. We're not quite sure. We know that his story and his style of speaking and writing is mixed Israelite, but also Hittite and Egyptian in the stuff that he says. It's very similar. So we know that regionally he's somewhere between the two rivers in Egypt is where he's living, which could be also Israel or Palestine if we're using antiquity terms. Do we learn anything about God in this? The answer should be yes, but what do you learn about God in this?
He's always in control.
He's in control, and counter to what we tell ourselves, God is incredibly graceful to people who seek him, even if they're not all there yet. When he goes to Jeroboam, who's a rebellious tribe against the legitimate leadership, against the anointed of God's descendants, he gives them a chance. He gives all of them opportunity, all of them the outcome that way. What do we learn about people in all of this?
They're people.
There's no functional difference between people who inhabited the earth 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago or today. Any last comments in that area before we close out? The clock says we've got 13 seconds. So
God was always fair to them and telling them both sides what was going to happen if they would follow him and what was going to happen if they didn't.
absolutely.
They had no excuse.
Clear expectations, clear consequences were already laid on the table in all instances. That's it for this morning. We'll continue looking at the Kings in these levels of detail going forward.